From Henry VII to Elizabeth I, the Tudor dynasty ruled the Kingdom of England, the port of Calais in France, Ireland, and the Channel Islands for 118 years. The rise of this royal house was the beginning of a journey for England and its people. In 1485, Henry Tudor, the only son of Edmund Tudor, the first Earl of Richmond, seized the crown. His mother was Margaret Beaufort, a direct ancestor of Edward III, which gave him, Henry, a weak claim to the throne of England. For decades, England had been rocked by a war called the War of the Roses, which had pitted the royal houses of York and Lancaster against one another in an epic struggle to rule England. The crown had been passed back and forth between these two rival families for many years, and now the war was over. Richard III, the last of the Yorkists, lay dead. His body would be thrown naked over a horse and taken to what is today a car park and buried in a pauper's grave. The new king had established his regime at the invitation of an exhausted and impatient parliament, which had granted Henry the throne according to his right of conquest, having beaten the late King Richard III on the fields of Bosworth. The nation had very little stomach left for continued hostilities, and the Tudors began their long rule. Henry VII was to be a frugal, grasping, and tight-fisted monarch, and set about cementing his new government. He personally took control of the royal finances and used a system of financial blackmail to keep the nobility of the realm poorer than the crown. The nobility had played a major part in the War of the Roses, and Henry understood that powerful earls and dukes could be the undoing of kings. He therefore had Parliament enact a series of laws that made all previous supporters of the Yorkists prior to his own reign traitors, many of whom were forced to pay huge fines rather than lose their heads and their property. Paying the fine exempted them from confiscation of this property, and they would still be able to pass on their titles to their sons. Thus the nobility was cowed, and the king had an income. The Tudor dynasty had gotten off to a good start, but not all were as easily browbeaten as had the nobles been. Disgruntled Cornishmen had risen up against Henry in 1497, and two pretenders to the throne, Perkin Warbeck and Lambert Simnel, had both made separate attempts to seize the throne and make themselves King of England. Perkin Warbeck was executed for his attempt in 1499, and Lambert Simnel was given a job in the royal kitchens. This appears to be because Henry saw Simnel as a puppet of his Yorkist enemies, not as the instigator of the revolt. This showed that he at least had some level of mercy and compassion. However, the result of these insurrections was immediately influential upon the king, and he began to exhibit signs of extreme paranoia. He used the medieval Star Chamber, which was a form of royal law court, to directly dispense justice on those he deemed to be a threat to his family. Contrary to popular belief, the Star Chamber was popular amongst the people, as it showed that the authorities had control of the warring factions that had blighted the country in the years of the Wars of the Roses. This is also around the time where the myths and legends regarding Richard III originated. Although there is no evidence that Richard III had killed his nephews in order to gain power, he remains a suspect thanks to the Tudor propagandists, chiefly William Shakespeare. There has been some suggestion that Henry VII himself may have had the boys killed in the Tower, but we will never know who was directly responsible for their untimely deaths. The princes in the Tower were two young boys, Edward V of England and Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. The two brothers were the only sons of Edward IV of England and Elizabeth Woodville. They were alive, apparently, at the time of Richard III's death in 1485. However, nobody knows what happened to them. Edward IV was, of course, Richard III's brother, and if they had been alive at the time of Richard III's death, and if they were in the Tower of London at the time of Henry VII coming to power, it is highly likely that Henry VII would have had them killed, as they would have been the true heirs to the throne of England. Henry VII was completely aware of the fragility of his claims to be King of England, so he immediately married Elizabeth of York, heiress of the Yorkist dynasty. This sought to unite the two families, which is immortalised in the Tudor Rose of England, the red representing the Rose of Lancaster and the white representing the Rose of York. The two immediately produced an heir, Arthur Tudor, who was born in 1486. As Henry's reign wore on, his son and heir, Arthur, was married to the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand of Castile in Spain. Her name was Catherine of Aragon. Her first marriage to Arthur was not to be the last that she would experience, because Arthur died in 1502, having failed to sleep with her on his first night as a married man. The question of whether or not the marriage was ever consummated after that would have dire consequences for the future of Catholicism in England. Devastated by the death of his oldest son, Henry VII began to show his age, and in 1503 the Queen, Elizabeth of York, died, leaving the king in a state of constant depression. His last act of significance was to successfully wriggle out of paying back the dowry to Catherine of Aragon's parents when she became a widow following the death of Prince Arthur. Isabella and Ferdinand had paid an enormous amount of gold to Henry VII for the honour of having his son, Prince Arthur, marry their daughter, Catherine. He managed to get around having to pay the money back by having her, Catherine, marry his second oldest son, Henry. This match, as we will see, would change the destiny of England and maybe even the world. Henry VII died in 1509, having seized the throne, defeated several rebellions, and taken judicial and financial control of the state into his own royal hands. He also brought the aristocracy under control, thus preventing any future civil unrest between rival royal factions. This had made him extremely popular, but by the time he had died, he had become nothing more, really, than a ghost, a shell. He was also given the epithet Winter King. His son Prince Henry assumed the title of Henry VIII to wild acclaim. The Renaissance prince represented a glorious and peaceful new reign.